Welcome to this presentation of safety and security in times of civil unrest. As you've noticed, it's a co-presentation of myself at Behavioral Science Applications and one of our strategic partners, Dr. Tal Braun at the Violence Prevention Agency. A few housekeeping things very quickly as we get started. First of all, I think we have everyone muted. I'll ask you to keep cameras and microphones turned off to reduce background sort of chatter. If you have to communicate with myself or Tao, please use the chat window about anything technical like audio or other sorts of problems, and use the Q&A feature for any questions that we perhaps will have a chance to take at the end of the program. So myself and Tao will be looking at the chat window periodically. We won't necessarily be looking at the Q&A window until the end of the program. Everyone who's registered will get a PDF of the slides, so hopefully that'll keep any note-taking to a minimum, and you'll also get a link to a recording of the program as well. Now, I know it was advertised as being 60 minutes. It's probably a little closer to 70 minutes. What you'll notice is I do keep a pretty quick tempo through the whole program because there's an awful lot I'd like to share with you. So let's kind of get started. You'll also notice that certainly when it comes to photography of protests around the country and around the world, we're drawing on the excellent photojournalistic work of many organizations and many people. So we're applying fair use standards. You'll recognize that there was no charge for you to participate in the program today. And as an educational tool, we're going to use some of their photography and other information. Now, very quickly, as my background, my training is as a clinical psychologist, but today I work in an area that's primarily known as operational psychology, which you could think of as the use of clinical, cognitive, and social psychological ideas for their tactical value. I've been a disaster responder for about 31 years. I was boots on the ground at both the 93 and 9/11 World Trade Center attacks, ran psych operations at New Jersey's Anthrax Screening Center. My work goes all the way back to working with the FBI on the Unabomber case in the 90s. And when I'm not involved in direct threat assessment sorts of cases, work with all kinds of agencies at the state, federal, and international level. So the only other thing really to throw in there as a way of an introduction is myself, I've actually been trained on both sides of the shield, having gone through FEMA's Center for Domestic Preparedness Field Force Operations class, being trained in crowd control sorts of procedures and tactics as well, and have been embedded as a field information or field intelligence officer in large crowds and different protests around the country over the years. So I do have a bit of a feel for both sides of the shield, as I mentioned. Now the program is going to move pretty quickly, and it actually goes through 7 different blocks of instruction, some slightly shorter than others or longer. But the last of these is actually one of the most important. And the information in section 7 regarding safety and survival, much of that I would actually invite you to consider sharing with friends, family, and loved ones who may find themselves in any type of crowd situation, never mind just a protest, really in terms of how to navigate that environment in a safe way. It's information I've taught my friends and family over the years, and many people who've been through our program have remembered some of these concepts and found them very useful in different situations throughout their life. Please, though, let's be clear that nothing I share in the program is intended to be a criticism or a critique of First Amendment rights for assembly, for speech, etc. Really what we do, most of us in different first responder roles, is actually be out there so we can help facilitate people's ability for their First Amendment expression, rather than certainly suppress it. But we know that there are some hazards that come along with that. Now, we also know that most crowd events are peaceful and don't represent much of a risk of violence. But as you'll hear from me in a few moments, although not all crowds are violent, all crowds are potentially dangerous. So I'm going to be speaking from a first responder standpoint, both as someone who's been a behavioral scientist involved with emergency management, but also as a long-time EMT, really about being boots on the ground in these environments, specifically in those environments that represent a danger or a risk to our personnel and our assets. So as we think about that, we have just recently re-entered a whole new era of civil unrest, both here in the US and around the world. And things have changed. If you've previously had training or experience in crowd behavior, we're kind of in some uncharted territory. One of the things, obviously, that makes this very novel is that we're dealing with a global disease outbreak, the COVID-19 pandemic, simultaneously as we're dealing with large groups of crowds or large crowds of individuals, which certainly complicates and magnifies some of the risks, both crowd-related risks and certainly the pandemic-related risks as well. So let's talk about our program and get ourselves rolling. Our goal is to improve your ability to effectively anticipate and respond to the behavioral challenges in group, crowd, and mob situations. Groups, crowds, and mobs, we'll discuss those and define those further. They're all people. And really for us, it's important to understand the likely behavior of those people in these different configurations that can actually give us a tactical advantage in responding safely and effectively to those environments. Our bottom line outcome is to better protect personnel and assets. Now, one of the things you'll notice pretty quickly as you come on board with our webinar today is I'm not going to be the instructor that reads each of the bullet points to you. Remember that you will be getting a PDF of the slide set, and you'll have all this material. But certainly in the interest of our time and the flow of the program, I'm really hitting the high marks on each of our slides. But really, we are talking about people, and it's very important, regardless if you have an orientation in the behavioral sciences or otherwise, for us to be making accurate behavioral assumptions. That's what my work is all about, is helping you and your agencies form accurate behavioral assumptions about what people are likely to do or not do in different emergency situations. What we find is, especially on this human factors piece, when we don't get the people piece of this right, our actions, our plans, and our policies can be ineffective, meaning essentially that we're not moving the dial, we're not having an effect on the crowd, or more specifically on the safety equation. Our behavior can be inappropriate, meaning simply that we could under or overreact to a crowd in a way that we actually become the accelerant. We actually potentially can create a flashpoint or a trigger and escalate the situation. And therefore, our behavior or our misunderstanding or lack of understanding of crowd behavior actually can create a dangerous situation if that crowd does flash over into more of a dangerous mob. So the launch pad for our discussion today will be Lewin's equation. If you're not familiar, Dr. Kurt Lewin is thought to be the father of social psychology. Crowd psychology is a branch of social psychology. And Lewin had famously said, the human behavior is a function of the interaction between a person and their environment. Crowd scenarios are very unique environments. Someone who finds themselves embedded in a group of 100, 1,000, 100,000 people has the potential to do things they might not ever think about doing otherwise because of some of the psychological factors we'll discuss later in the program. So we know these are very, very unique environments that do really create different sorts of behaviors we don't see outside of crowds. Now, we can't hope to know every one of the people, but we can say with a high degree of confidence in what sort of environments are we likely to see what types of behaviors. And that's kind of where we're going throughout our program. As an instructor, as a behavioral scientist, and as a tactical responder, both as a EMT and working in my role as a deputy sheriff with the Atlantic County, New Jersey Sheriff's Officer on our police surgeons team, as I said, I've had an occasion to be out in the field on many instances, and I kind of formed these two evidence-informed ideas. The first is that all of our disciplines, regardless if you're law enforcement, EMS, emergency management, public health, and so forth, we all have the potential to end up in a group, crowd, or mob situation, whether by being deployed into that environment or otherwise, if it's a spontaneous sort of reaction. But I've also found in my training that most of us have never had any formal classroom training in group, crowd, or mob behavior. So as we think about that, it's important for us to, spend a little time learning more about that as we were able to share with each other. Three converging trends where we are today, they're kind of driving or advancing crowd behavior. First of all is world population. Right now we're about 7.8 billion people, projected to be about 9 billion people by 2045. And more than half of those people today have daily access to cell phones and social media sorts of applications. And that allows for much quicker sorts of communication. And that communication could be the spread of good information, bad information, misinformation, or rumor, all which potentially can accelerate crowd behavior. And we're also right now in a time globally of greater perceived socioeconomic injustice and disparity. When we take those three trends combined, we actually have the formula for much more civil unrest and crowd sort of behavior than we've had previously in other times. When we think about the term civil unrest, to begin with, certainly not all civil unrest is protest, and not all civil unrest is something like a riot. If you think about this somewhat on a continuum, this can begin with something as simple as a work slowdown or a work stoppage or something like a picket line or a labor strike. And certainly labor strikes and such can get aggressive and can get violent as well. But there's a whole range in the middle of more passive sorts of activities like sit-ins and die-ins, other nonviolent protests, and then up on the more aggressive end of the continuum, things like riots, arson, looting, sabotage, and so forth that can be part of the mix. So here, as we use the term civil unrest throughout the program, try to imagine or keep in mind at least that it really is talking about the entire spectrum of these different sorts of behaviors. But regardless of what type of collection of people it is, groups, crowds, mobs, or otherwise, I'd like you to hold on to these three key concepts. First, disasters can create crowds. If we have a natural disaster, technological disaster, and so forth, it could, really spontaneously drive so many people together in one place at one time. But crowds can also create disasters, and we'll elaborate on that further. But the bottom line, very important for us as first responders, is that while not all crowds are violent, all crowds are potentially dangerous, and that dangerousness arises primarily from the interaction between the psychological forces of the crowd and the physical forces of the crowd. These are well documented and researched. We'll look at some of that research later in the program. Simply not my opinion. People who have been in the field have seen this up close and personal, and those of us who have both looked at it up close and personal and academically can find a lot of evidence to support these ideas. So if you take a look with me at this graphic, and I know a few of you are on a telephone, I'm not sure if you're able to see the screen as well. This is a graphic of protests last year in Hong Kong last fall, pro-democracy, anti I'm trying to think of the term anti-extradition protests that were going on. It was not unusual during the Hong Kong protests to have 1 million to 2 million people in the street at one time. Obviously, 1 million people in one place at one time is a potential recipe for disaster, just again by people being packed in so tightly. So think about this from a law enforcement or a first responder standpoint, maybe EMS, for example. If we have someone go down in that crowd, pass out, become sick, become injured, just imagine trying to get to them, extricate them from that crowd, and bring them out for care. So there are inherent dangers just from the physics of crowds. And then what you'll learn later is that most people who are injured and most people who die in crowds do not die from crowd violence. They die from what's referred to as crowd crush. Crowd crush is compressional asphyxiation. And we'll explore that more when we talk about the physics of crowds later on. So let's start by kind of leveling the field and making sure we're all using the terms group, crowd, and mobs in a similar way for this program. And we'll introduce the idea of riots into this description as well. To begin with, a group is a smaller number of people, temporarily gathered, but the defining feature is they already know each other. They may be friends, family, neighbors, coworkers, or whatever. but they know each other and they come with pre-existing bonds and a strong level or degree of loyalty to each other. So a perceived offense against one is potentially perceived as an offense against all. And they're likely to stick together, they're likely to stand up for each other. So a very quick analogy or example, someone in your community is hurt today or becomes sick, they're rushed to the emergency department of a local hospital. Friends and family gather outside that emergency department waiting for news, and now a security guard from the hospital has to go outside and tell them to break up, back up, leave this area. We could see that strong bond, although there's not necessarily a leader of that group. We could see how these folks will stick together and stand up against that security officer. That's a group. A crowd is a larger number of people, also temporarily gathered, but in crowds in general, as you'll see, there's different types of crowds, people typically continue to think and act as individuals. Most crowds do not have leaders per se, and most crowds, as I said, individuals retain their individuality, and they're there kind of acting and moving on their own, just a lot of people in the same place. But yes, it depends on what type of crowd. A casual crowd is like the last photograph of people maybe gathered at a large shopping event, something like a Black Friday sale, in which, yeah, there's a commonality that everyone is there for a good deal, but people aren't, unified in some way. There's not a leader per se. They're all kind of doing their own thing, maybe even competing a little bit with each other. But that's a casual crowd. And the emotion is pretty low. What you'll notice is as I increase and talk about each different type of group, crowd, or mob, I'm kind of turning up the heat a little more towards that boiling point where the crowd can spill over into an aggressive or a violent mob. So if we turn it up a notch, we end up with a cohesive crowd. And here, as you see in the photograph, this may be fans of the ball game, fans of a team, fans of a band, fans of a political leader or religious leader gathered at a big event. And while there's not leadership per se, yes, someone may start a chant or someone may start a wave, there's not necessarily clear organizing leadership, but there is a high level of emotion and a common sense of purpose. We're all there, pulling for this team or this band and so forth. The emotion they bring is typically positive. Now that's different when we talk about an expressive crowd. An expressive crowd gathers to ventilate. They want their opinions heard. They're pro this, they're anti that. They're trying to move the needle on social issues or governmental policy. They very often do have leadership, and that leadership is usually very charismatic and practiced and skillful. This group, or crowd rather, also comes with a very, very high level of emotion. It's usually a negative emotion like anger or frustration. So we're turning up the heat with different types of crowds. And lastly, the type of crowd that's closest to becoming that aggressive or angry mob we'll refer to as an aggressive crowd. The defining features of the aggressive crowd is they also have very skillful leadership, leaders who, again, perhaps have been trained and educated in this sort of thing, or charismatic, as I mentioned, have a lot of sway. But this crowd has a clear motive, an objective. And I'll give you a good example. Let's think about Occupy in 2011, the Arab Spring, right? So here's the group in Tahrir Square in Cairo, and essentially have drawn a line in the sand to say, we're not leaving until President Mubarak is deposed. And they held their ground. And as you know from history, President Mubarak was deposed, was arrested and jailed, and the group kind of dug in their heels. They obviously come with a very high degree of emotion as well. That emotion is usually negative. Again, it's usually anger and frustration. This is the type of crowd that is closest to that tipping point where they may flash over into a more violent sort of mob. Now, the things that kind of flip the switch and have a crowd, any type of crowd, turn into a mob really are referred to as flashpoints. And there's several very well documented flashpoints. Probably some of the most common are things like number 5, perception of excessive use or inappropriate use of force by the authorities. That kind of gives license to the crowd to push back or fight back if it feels that aggression is being abused or inappropriately used by authorities. Number 1 is very common, denial of access, when we say no. And I want you to think not just as a crowd at a protest now, but let's put it into the context of COVID-19, and maybe in the fall, maybe next spring, we have a vaccine. And you have 100 or several hundred people lined up at the school gym to get that vaccine, and someone is turned away, or the whole group is turned away because we've run out of medication. You could see people, again, pushing back, becoming agitated, becoming aggressive in those situations. Number 2 and number 6 are very similar when people are not obeying the rules, and you know this since you've been a little kid. If someone cuts in line, it kind of invites people to fight back against that. And the last of these is a lack of organization. If we seem like we don't have a grip on the situation, it invites others to step in. Now, a mob is that crowd that has flashed over and now has lost its sense of fear for any sort of consequences. And it's instilled with a very, very intense sense of purpose to achieve its goal. This again, when we see this, is people who are now not fearful at all at arrest, at injury, at property damage, and so forth, and that may be part of the equation. So this again is a different sort of thing, and we see much more dangerous behavior, obviously, in this situation. But there are different kinds of mobs as well. The first of these is an aggressive mob. The aggressive mob sets out. They set right out of the box to create havoc, to create violence, and obviously do through things like looting, through property damage. We've seen this around the country and around the world increased over the several weeks. Obviously, these could be racial riots, political riots, prison riots. There's a whole host of different things that may be motivating. Now, this is different than an escape mob. An escape mob are people running away from something and can lose their sense of reasoning. And again, we can have violent or dangerous behavior, and that is people compete to escape, but it's based on a state of panic. And I'll give you a very strong example of that in just a moment. An acquisition or acquisitive mob is people running towards something instead of away, usually something like a food riot or a water riot. These are more common in the wake of disasters and other sorts of governmental problems. But we have a whole range of different kinds of mobs. Now, panic is actually unlikely in most disasters, but panic is more likely when we have 2 features in the mix. One is perception of limited opportunity for escape, and the other is perception of limited availability of critical supplies. So that may be people competing for food or water, or in the most recent, our pandemic, things like personal protective equipment and sanitizer, and even silly things like toilet paper. But here, people are competing either to escape or acquire something, significant. Example, this is a huge religious pilgrimage moving through the streets of Baghdad in August of 2005. And at a certain point, they have to cross a bridge to get to the other side of this river, and it's a choke point, and we have several hundred people on the bridge. Someone on the bridge yells out that they believe they have seen wires hanging from someone's backpack. They call out that there's a suicide bomber on the bridge. In the stampede to get off the bridge, 953 people are killed. Guess what? No bomber. Just perception of limited opportunity for escape. So this is a very, very clear example of the principle that crowds can create disasters. In this instance, we have a mass casualty event that's created simply by human behavior. There was no other risk. When we think about the difference between mobs and riots, mobs really are about the people, and riots are describing the action. So we can have mobs again, that we understand have a higher violence potential. But when we have this kind of widespread violence that we've seen in several US cities and worldwide over the last few weeks, that's when we start to talk about, really almost an interchangeable way, mobs who are rioting or rioting mobs, things of that nature. Now, very quickly, there are different types of riots. Some that we see after maybe the home team wins the championship. We'll call that a celebratory, spontaneous riot. And sometimes they make no sense at all. Like, man, we just won the championship. Why are people busting up our stores and lighting cars on fire and such? But those are usually right in the immediate vicinity of an event. This could be in a city or a college campus. Our team has won, our team has lost. Maybe there was something perceived unfair about the win or the loss. Things of that nature. And alcohol is very often part of that celebratory environment that can fuel that aggression. Spontaneous riots due to controversial events, that's what we've seen around the country and around the world when we, in the wake of something like an officer-involved shooting incident or other perceived violence by often law enforcement or the authorities in different ways, in which it's controversial from a social standpoint, a racial standpoint, and so forth. These are probably the most common sorts that we see, but you also can see the spontaneous riot turn into a continuation or an organized riot over the next several days. And what this implies, and it adds to the dangerousness, is we typically see other more practiced protesters start to come into the environment. They may be anarchists, which we'll discuss in a few moments. They may be other political operatives and so forth. But now we see that thing that began spontaneously in the wake of a controversial event now last for 20 something days, which we're seeing. So these have this element of both being organized, but also on the heels of a spontaneous event. And then obviously there are organized protests. And in many instances, if you're not familiar with this concept, the organizers and the leaders of different groups will actually liaison with and negotiate with law enforcement prior to the event about like how many people will be arrested, people who are gladly going to volunteer to be arrested to make a point. So the violence potential in this is actually a little lower because there's an element of preparedness for it, both by our responders and also by the actual protesters themselves. So what you've learned so far is there's a big difference between a group, a crowd, a mob, and even a mob and a riot, and there's actually several different types. What this plays back to as we move along is the idea that it's important to get it right because it helps us anticipate the likely behavior and the violence potential, and it also helps prevent us from over or under reacting to the situation, which could obviously accelerate and help fuel violence in that environment. So let's talk a little bit about the role of social media. You and I are the first generation of responders really to have to deal with the combination of cellular communication and social media platforms. I refer to this often as civil unrest 2.0, which is technologically enabled collective action. And this has radically changed the protest environment and the collective action environment. It's nothing like it was in our parents' generation during the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s, or the anti-war movements in Vietnam in the late 60s and so forth. This has radically changed the environment. Let me give you an example of how. We believe, looking at the history books, it probably took between 8 and 10 months for the organizers of the Civil Rights March in 1963 to get that moving, primarily using the postal system and telephone. That was the major ways of communication. The Arab Spring in 2011 took about 10 days to organize using primarily social media platforms. So the time frame from flash to bang has radically changed. That time frame from people having the idea and that initial instinct to get together and collectively, demonstrate, and the ability to actually mobilize, that has tightened down to hours, if not minutes, in many instances. So you and I, as responders, are in a very, very different environment, and things can happen very quickly now. Now, one of the early manifestations of this goes back now about a decade or so, which was the onset of what we refer to as flash mobs. When flash mobs started, which is essentially communicating with people using text or other messaging services, people got together for silly events. I mean, they were just goofy things like National Pillow Fight Day or silent discos, or all kinds of dancing, sort of events. And using text messages, people would seemingly spontaneously appear in a park or a shopping area, do their thing, and then just as quick as they showed up, pretty much just disappear. So when we talk about the term flash mob today, it doesn't usually have the same fun implication. We're usually talking about groups of people who are coordinating and gathering using social media and cellular communications for adverse sorts of behavior or nefarious sorts of behavior. So let me give you an example of where we saw this first. And it actually goes back a few years now to the London riots in late July, early August 2011. At that time, one of the most popular types of cell phones in London, at least, or in the UK, was the BlackBerry. Not always thought to be like the coolest or the hippest phone, but one of the things that was very effective was the BlackBerry Messenger network, which was encrypted and actually prevented law enforcement from really getting that sort of intelligence to be able to follow the movement of rioters. This started with an individual, a young man dying in police custody. It began as that spontaneous sort of riot we mentioned before, and very, very quickly morphed into a week-long event of looting and arson and so forth. And using the BlackBerry Messenger service, the group in the crowd was actually able to stay one step ahead of the police for the entire week. It became, as the police referred to, somewhat of a game of whack-a-mole. So you could see here some of the quotes from people's Blackberries. Everyone in Edmonton, Enfield, everywhere in the north, link up at Enfield Town Station at 4, bring cars, vans, also hammers. Link up and cause havoc, their spelling, not mine. Just drop everything, the police can't stop it. And at that moment, they were right. In fact, when we look at that, one of the things that also started to change the equation, and we still see today, is through the use of these communications, we cast a much wider net for potential participants in something like a protest or a riot. In 2011 in London, or at least in Enfield Town, we saw that about 40% of those people coming in to riot each night were commuting in during the evening or the night, participating in the riots, and then commuting back out of there and returning the next day. So here, we actually know that this casts a much wider net potentially of participants in an event the way we're able to communicate. Now, we referred to that as the shadow network back in 2011, and today we have a much different shadow network because of all the different sorts of encrypted apps that people could download, and typically download at no cost. These again complicate the collection of open source intelligence. They again can give the protester or demonstrator a little bit of a tactical advantage in communicating, organizing, and moving their people around. And there's other features like, the ability now that wasn't there in 2011 to quickly move videos and photographs that could really fire people up, or to communicate in ways that are geo-enabled, that I could simply, by the push of one button, share information to everyone in a 5-mile radius. And we also know that some of these products, they actually have their messages self-delete or delete after they're viewed, again, stifling law enforcement efforts in many instances. But these social media applications and the way people can join a group, join or follow other individuals, helps fuel their motivation for collective behavior. It could trigger feelings of group identity, like I belong to this, I'm on the group. Really helps fuel feelings of injustice and emotions like anger. So even remotely, we can get a lot of people swept up into the emotion of a crowd or a mob through our virtual communications today. When we think about all of this then, as I said earlier, there is a violence potential in every crowd, even if it doesn't manifest itself. There is a dangerousness potential, as I brought about earlier, that just arises from the interaction of the psychology and the physics of crowds, something we'll go deeper into in the next several moments. But I want to talk a little bit about crowd violence potential. Two of the key drivers of violence potential are legitimacy and power. The perception of legitimacy, the perception of power. And we talk about legitimacy, the sense from the group that they don't need to obey the police and they don't need to obey the social order in general because they're corrupt. They may, cite recent events politically or from the media, other things in which the feeling of the group is, the people who are calling the shots, the authorities are not on the level with us. We no longer have a reason to follow their instructions, and that creates that sense of legitimacy for their action. The other is perception of power, real or imagined. And I want to give you a few examples of that as well, because that creates the dynamic where a large number of people feel they could actually take to the street without any real fear of consequences or punishment. Now, when we think about that, back in 2011, there were a number of examples of that I'll mention in a few moments, like the protesters were named the Person of the Year by Time magazine at the end of 2011 for all the social change they created. And very often in large protest group, they cited that as an example of their power. We know in the really onset of some of our modern era of collective action, there was an organization in place known as DAN, the Direct Action Network. It's largely broken up and become decentralized, but DAN was primarily involved in helping motivate, train, and educate activists based out of the Berkeley, California area, anti-corporate, anti-authoritarian, had a strong relationship with a number of different anarchist groups and levels of thinking. And again, if we think about their message, which was essentially rooted in an anarchist line of thought, part of the message was a small harm that they may be doing is necessary to help prevent a larger harm that the government's doing, the banks are doing, fill in the blank, but they feel that sense of justification, very much like we see with other sorts of violence. When we think about a group like Antifa, Antifa is over the timeline, relatively new over the last several years. And as you know, the term Antifa is a derivative of the larger phrase anti-fascists. As Antifa formed, their motives were anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-Semitic, against other forms of perceived social injustice. But they originally set out to be a nonviolent group. What happened when Antifa happens very often in other groups is they get somewhat infiltrated and co-opted by the more mainstream anarchist groups. And part of the central idea in anarchist thinking is that no social change is possible without the use of violence. Therefore, when we see anarchist insertion into crowds, we do actually expect material damage, property damage, and the likelihood of violence because it's part of their mindset. Now, Antifa, as a faction of anarchist thought, we go back one step further. Anarchist thought is a subset or a splinter of socialism. Anarchists would, by their own thinking, tear down all forms of hierarchy in society. So you see their motto here, there's no government like no government. They believe all structure and hierarchy in society suppresses human potential. So whether it's in government, it's in business, it's in education, it's in, class and social structure, they would really, seek to tear down all of that sort of structure in our society to liberate people to really achieve their greatest potential. And they do this through a combination of both nonviolent and what is referred to in anarchist thought as not nonviolent sorts of tactics. I'm only going to touch on a few very quickly. If you're not familiar with something like tripoding, these long poles will come into a protest environment, usually carrying banners and flags. They can be assembled quickly to stand up this tripod. And what you can't see so clearly in this photograph is in most tripoding situations, the individual's not only in a sit harness, but very often has a noose around their neck as well, which will stymie police efforts from trying to quickly pull that person down. Something like that, as you'll see in the bottom photograph, an individual using a kryptonite bike lock to chain herself by the neck to the gates outside the White House. And this is one of several people who've done this, and of course hasn't brought the key to that lock. The kryptonite bike locks are some of the hardest to actually cut through. Obviously, the hackle of this lock is right against the protester's neck. It's going to be a heck of a job for field extrication officers to, get that off of this person in a safe and an effective manner. But there's other techniques as well if you're not familiar. For example, sleeping dragons. On the bottom photograph here, you see people who are going curb line to curb line using sleeping dragons, which are essentially a piece of pipe, typically PVC, but can be other materials, in which there's a chain running through, and using a carabiner, protesters will reach through, snap themselves into the chain, and form this human chain across the street, building to building, road, curb line to curb line, in a way that police can't effectively get to those chains and cut using a bolt cutter, cut through them. You'll also notice here the officer in the upper left-hand corner holding a sleeping dragon, that the outside of the PVC tube has been covered with duct tape, and that's used to gum up the saw blades of any officer's tools trying to cut through that piece of pipe. And on the right side, you see actually a field extrication officer cutting through some of that pipe, trying to liberate someone from a sleeping dragon situation. But more concerning are the non-violent tactics. And they range from things like slingshots, some of them that can create an equal velocity to small handguns, small caliber handguns, catapults, something as simple as a lacrosse stick that could be used to launch a tear gas canister back at the police. If you're not familiar, I'd like to introduce you to caltrops. Caltrops on the ground look like jacks from a child's game of ball and jacks, but they have been sharpened. They're going to puncture the tires of a vehicle. They're going to stick in the soles of your boots. They're going to stick in the hooves of mounted patrol on horseback. And then there's, of course, incendiary devices we see in these large violent protests that range from Molotov cocktails to tiki lights and so forth, all different sorts of weapons. And then also the possibility of things like improvised riot control agents, meaning something like homemade tear gas. And there's no shortage of websites with instructions for making homemade tear gas. But we also see noxious substances like bleach, urine, ammonia, paint, blood, whether that's theatrical blood, animal blood, and in some instances human blood, that are thrown on riot control officers or field force officers as a way, again, to make their, really make their task very, very difficult. But this is always curious to me, and I think this audience will appreciate this. Just as we have all trained in the incident command system, for a group that is against all forms of hierarchy, the protest group very often use a incident command structure themselves. Some of the key features are things like a spokesperson, the equivalent of our public information officer, finance branch to help bail people out of jail, media branch, much like a public information officer again, but also an intel group of people on bicycles very often who will ride into different streets and neighborhoods to find out where the police are or aren't. But one that's most interesting are the medical groups. And the medics, the street medics, are trained in a model known as the Black Cross. And here you can see a copy of the Black Cross training manual. These individuals very often are themselves docs and nurses who are sympathetic to the cause, donate their time, and come out in the field knowing that the protesters do not want to use civilian EMS or law enforcement for assistance if they're hurt. They're going to go to these street medics, and the street medics are out doing their thing. So let's talk a little bit about some of the psychology and the physics of crowds. Obviously, this could be a semester-long discussion, but let's talk about just the high points in understanding the psychology. One of the primary driving factors is anonymity. That when people are lost in a huge crowd, it somehow gives them license to really disregard the rules because they can feel that no one can identify them, no one could apprehend them, that they're not going to be held responsible for their actions. So one of the primary drivers is that sense of being anonymous. Speaking of which, very often we associate this mask, the Guy Fawkes mask, with the hacktivist group Anonymous, but the group was also used by occupiers in the Occupy Wall Street movement, used around the world by all kinds of groups, individuals who are primarily anti-government. It is a caricature of Guy Fawkes, who is a well-known anarchist and arsonist back in the early 1600s. It's also popularized by the movie V for Vendetta. Very interesting if you look at the storyline of that movie. It was made in 2005, but it's about the year 2020 when a virus is running around the world, wiping people out, and we have different things happening at a political level. So really curious, but very interesting as well to help push back against these kind of masks. Many communities actually have anti-mask laws, which a protester can have a mask on their head, have it tipped up, but not pulled down covering their face because it fuels that anonymity. Universality is a sense that everyone in the group is doing it, so I'm free to do it as well, whatever that is. It may be looting, it may be property damage. Convergence, that we all have a shared view of the end state, what needs to be done, so we might as well all act together. But inability to withdraw is something slightly different. That's a person who gets caught up in the crowd behavior, sometimes even including violence, and continues to do that because they're afraid not to. They're afraid if they stop, the crowd will flip on them, so they continue to do that out of fear. The other two dynamics, similar to groupthink, are social suggestion and contagion. And social suggestion is the idea that since we're all in the same boat, we all have the same ideas and so forth, we all should be participating in the same sort of behavior. And lastly, contagion. And I know that almost all of us on the call have felt contagion from one time to another. Usually it's positive contagion. You've been at a ball game, a concert, a political or religious event, and you feel that kind of electricity move through the crowd. You feel that energy and excitement move through the group, and it's usually a good thing. A lot of fun, a lot of excitement. But that can also be a negative emotion. It could be anger and frustration and such that moves through a crowd in that contagious manner, and that can happen very, very quickly. That leads us to a very quick discussion of the physics of crowd, because it's in the interaction between the physics of crowds and the psychology of crowds that we have our dangerousness potential. If you're able to see this photograph with me, as I said, a number of you are on the telephone, but if you're able to see your screen, what you see is Hajj. In fact, Hajj 2010 in Mecca. Hajj is the annual Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca, thought to be the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad. On this year, photograph 2010, 3.4 million people in one place at one time. Now, the Hajj routinely draws about 2 million or more at each annual event. This year was particularly crowded. And if you look at that photograph of 3.5 million people packed together, obviously anything that goes wrong is going to go wrong in a big way. So there is a dangerousness potential just involved in the sheer numbers of people gathered. Example, one of the worst stampedes at Hajj was in 2015. And there's varying reports on the numbers. If we listen to the Saudis, the numbers are much lower. If we listen to the Iranians, the numbers are much higher. But we think about 2,000 people at least were killed in the stampede. It started with something as simple as a few people tripping and falling down, people around them panicking. There have been several major stampedes over the years at Hajj, and they have been mass casualty events. None of them have resulted from violence. They have just been based on people's behavior, caused usually by panic and anxiety in the large crowd. And so as I said to you earlier, most people who are hurt, most people who die in a crowd actually die standing up. And they don't die from violence, they're not injured from violence. It's the result of compressional asphyxiation, known more plainly as crowd crush. Now think about this as a first responder. as our personnel are moving in and out of the environment, we know we do have the potential ourselves to experience crowd crush. We think people need at least 1 square yard around them to respirate, to ambulate, to move and to breathe. We know is at least a minimum of just 5 people crushing in on us from each side can result in people being unconscious within about 30 seconds and dead on their feet in about 6 minutes or so. When the crowd loosens, these individuals typically fall, they drop, they are stumbled over. It can appear to be blunt force trauma. Most people, though, actually are dead before they even hit the ground. So this represents a risk to us. It's the #1 cause of death and injuries in large crowds is actually compressional asphyxiation, not simply violence, although violence potential may be part of the mix as well. The UK, unfortunately, has had their share of experiences with crowd crush emergencies. And at an academic level, one of the models used to describe and discuss this phenomena is known as FIST. Now, without getting into all of the details of FIST, which are force, information, space, and timing, the abbreviation for those 4 elements, the force is the one we're going to isolate on for a moment. Even in a vertical position, people standing up and pushing against each other, 5 people compressing you from all sides can create more than 700 pounds of pressure, preventing you from really catching your breath. And if people are piled onto each other, we'll refer to that as vertical pressure, we could end up with levels of force of 900 or more pounds, which can prevent, obviously, anyone from breathing and resulting in this sort of compressional asphyxiation I mentioned. So what do we do about it? Here's information I'd like to share with you as a first responder, regardless of your discipline, and also some information for you to take home for friends or family. Remember, we're just coming up on about an hour's time. I mentioned to people at the onset of this, we're probably likely to go to about 65 or 70 minutes before we've completed the program. So please hang in there with us for another few moments if you could. There's a very important distinction between crowd control and crowd management. Crowd control tends to be a tactical response, and it tends to be reactive. The crowd is gathered, we're deployed there, we're reacting, and probably don't have a lot of insight into the crowd dynamics until we're actually boots on the ground. Crowd management is proactive and strategic, and I understand we can't always employ that because crowds can be spontaneous. But obviously we have an advantage if we know there's a crowd gathering and we can kind of create some of the parameters about where they're going, how they're going, and even communication with their leadership. But crowd management is obviously preferred when it's possible. Taking this from SWAT Officer Dan Morcow's Police One entry a few years ago, some really good advice for our responders. And the first 3 or 4 points are probably the most important to us, and I'm going to isolate to those. Have a practice plan and possess shared skills across our disciplines in a coordinated manner, which means EMS, law enforcement, other emergency management factors, and so forth, all are trained and oriented in a similar way. We all kind of have the same information, at least things about rules of engagement, thresholds for the use of violence, or force, other ideas, again, so that we're not caught off guard. If I think about something like tear gas doesn't discriminate. It depends on which way the wind is blowing. If you're an EMS responder, you may not be geared up in terms of protection if the wind changes direction, and now you're in the way of that tear gas. So we all need to understand the moving parts of our response, our tactical response to a crowd. Now, there's obviously a difference between planned and unplanned events, but we do need planning even for unplanned events. Here we are at the Apple store on the left with the introduction of the new Apple 17 or whatever, iPhone 17, years from now. You know this event's coming. You know it's coming weeks in advance. We work with store security to staff this, to work around crowd issues, signage, lines, regulating the crowd with things like wristbands and so forth. Let me talk about the photograph on the right. This is outside of Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood, and this event began with a tweet. a message goes out to the community that a well-known DJ is going to do a free concert that afternoon in front of Grauman's Chinese Theater in advance of a documentary that's going to premiere that night, a documentary about the Electric Daisy Festival. And here, literally tens of thousands of people nearly spontaneously showed up for this event. Guess what? It was just a rumor. The DJ was never coming. There was never going to be an event at all. How do you think the group handled that when they found out? Well, they went nuts. Of course, they're breaking store windows, flip a patrol car over, set it on fire. We have a full-blown sort of riot event there, an unplanned event. But even when something is that spontaneous, we as first responders need to have some plans. How are we getting our people safely in and out? How are we communicating? Are we all clear with law enforcement rules of engagement and thresholds for use of force? Reunification plans, if you get separated from your team, which is likely, and even the preservation of evidence because there may be criminal activity like looting or arson and so forth. What this means to us is it's very important for us to have shared training pre-deployment. Even the basic things I'm sharing with you here today about how we safely navigate a crowd. Never mind things specific to this event like escape routes, escalation ladders and points of contact, knowing our communication tools, and knowing our command structure. All that's critical for any of us going into a crowd environment, because you're not going to be able to communicate very well once the action starts. If we're doing this in advance, you know you're going to a crowd. We want you to go in with the best, initial briefing as possible, so you have as much clarity as possible, before the action starts. As I said, once things jump off, it can be really tricky. You, obviously, as an individual, need to go in with the highest degree of situational awareness you can. Situational awareness for what we refer to as the 2 Rs, risks and resources. Risks, what are the things that can hurt us? Resources, what are the things that could help us if something goes wrong? Again, once the action begins, it can get difficult to get a read on those aspects. Also important to have redundant communications. I'll tell you firsthand, both in training and in practice, it could be very difficult to hear radios, even something like a shoulder-mounted microphone, just because of the sheer volume of noise in the environment. Sometimes in protest groups, in anarchist groups, they're also blasting very, very loud music just to add to the chaos, add to the excitement, and this can make it very tricky for you to hear your normal communications. Like that, think about what you're wearing to this event. Regardless of your discipline, again, if you're non-law enforcement, EMS, other disciplines, make sure we have on the right kind of clothing, the right kind of shoes to provide protection for us. Make sure those are shoes that are going to stay on your feet, laced up, hopefully higher shoes to protect shins and so forth. But also not a bad idea to be wearing long sleeve t-shirts and so forth, not just from the sun, but also from chemical agents that may blow back. Have what you need to stay in the crowd. You're not going to be easily, going in or out of the environment. If you personally need anything medical, an inhaler, an EpiPen, something like this, have what you need. Have some basic food, have water. And we'd actually recommend, if you're bringing water, to have something like a water bottle with a sports top that allows you to squirt that. It provides a more powerful stream if you do need to wash tear gas or spray out of your eyes. I'm not going to read the next two slides to you. Please know that you will get a PDF of this package and be able to drill down a little bit. But it does talk about the idea of working in teams and recognize how quickly the environment could change. So I do give you some more notes really about that. But I want to finish with some very, very basic safety concepts to wrap up our session today. What I would suggest everyone should know. So this is the information I hope you share around the dinner table tonight. Everyone going into a crowd, whether that's a concert, it's a shopping event, it's a political event, it's a something like a protest, has their phone, has an ID, has a small flashlight. Why a small flashlight? Even in daytime, if we're separated from each other, we need to signal to everybody, to the other party, get up on something, flash that light. This is where I am. You may not be able to use your phone. You might not be able to hear your phone. The local cell phone towers might be overwhelmed by the number of people in the environment. So again, redundant communications. We talked about those shoes. And again, this is the dinner table talk, folks. So this is to your loved ones, not just responders. It's not flip-flop time, all right? Even though it's summer, shoes that are going to stay on, shoes that you can move and you can run in. Stay outside of the crowd whenever possible. If you have an option, walk around them rather than walk through them. And try not to wear into the environment anything that could get snagged or caught. The lanyard, the necklace, the scarf, the ID tag, things like that. Let's leave that at home when we're going to a crowd. Understand, if you're a responder of any type, if you're in uniform or have an ID on, the crowd is likely to try to push your buttons. The things they're saying, the things they're doing, spitting on you, things of this nature, in part are theater. They're theater, they're trying to get you to react so they get a photo opportunity of someone on the response team losing their stuff. So again, you're going to have to let some of this roll off your back. Don't take the bait. Don't take it personal. It's part of the game. Don't stop or stand near temporary structures. This is a stage. This is bleachers that have been put up. If people panic and they try to escape and they pile onto that stage or they pile onto those bleachers, if that thing collapses, the people on it, under it, and around it are likely to be badly hurt. So keep your distance from those sort of structures. And don't stand near immovable objects such as walls, or doors, or barricades, because if the crowd changes direction, you could be trapped in that as well. You could be pushed against that. Lastly, if you are or the crowd's moving, keep moving with the crowd. Try to keep your elbows out to the side to buy yourself a little more room to move and to breathe. But don't sit still or don't stand still. If the crowd is moving, you need to be moving with you, or they're just going to move you regardless. And if you've dropped something, unless it's absolutely precious to you, just let it go. Because once you go low on the ground to pick that up, it's likely that you get plowed right under. No one even knows you're down there. People could be standing on your hands or fingers in a way you can't get up. So think twice about bending down to pick anything up that's gone to the ground. If you fall down, if you're knocked down, try to get back to your feet as quickly as possible. If you can't get up, keep moving along with the crowd. Duck and cover, protect your airways, crawl with the crowd if you need to, but don't sit still. Now, if you live anywhere along the coasts, and you're familiar with the idea of riptides, you're swimming in the ocean, one of the things you've learned or you've seen on signs along the beach is if you're caught in a riptide that's trying to sweep you out to sea, you don't swim against it, you don't let it take you out to sea, you swim parallel to the beach until you break out of that current and you're free of its forces. The same rule applies with a moving crowd. Slowly and consistently begin pushing your way diagonally towards the perimeters of the crowd. Don't let the crowd take you, don't fight against them, but if you're consistent, if you're persistent, you will make it to the edges of the crowd where the forces lessen and you'll be able to break free. If you can't get up, as I said, you can't get out of the crowd, keep moving. If you're knocked down and you can't get up, crawl with the crowd. If you can't crawl, duck and cover. So hopefully what you've learned in our program is that most mass gatherings are peaceful, but even peaceful gatherings have a dangerousness potential. Some of that dangerousness arises from violence. Some of it arises purely from the physics and the psychology of crowds. Please feel free to share this information with others, both in your personal and your professional circles. We are in a time right now where we're likely to have more civil unrest and more group dynamics like this. So please pass this information along. Keep yourself safe. Remember, you're going to have the PDF. Embedded on the PDF are several links. One, for example, is back to my website where there's another program you can watch which talks just about surviving riots. You have information on how to reach myself at Behavioral Science Applications, a little about our organization, and also information on how to reach the Violence Prevention Agency and Dr. Tal Braun, who's been our host today putting us together. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Tal, if you have any closing comments or statements to make to the group, and then I'll actually open it up I'll stop the recording and then open it up for some questions. So Tal, before I stop the recording, if there's anything you'd like to say.
Well, first of all, thank you, Steve. Always great information to everyone out there. Mostly stay frosty. I think one of the most challenging things that Steve mentioned was not to get baited into reacting. We are in a world where a lot of people are mostly concerned about how many likes and followers they have, whether it's on TikTok or Instagram, and they will absolutely love using you to create more following. And so just remember, it's not personal, and stay out of that trap. Stay safe, everybody, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Tal. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.